Talking about an unemployed generation. They're young and experienced, but out of work and prospects.
The last job that I had was on March the 13th, and every job after that got cancelled.
And whilst the world's in lockdown, China's back to work, or is it? We take a look at how the world's second biggest economy is coping with the virus. The International Monetary Fund's the latest to issue a grim assessment. It believes the Great Lockdown is sparking the worst economic devastation since the Great Depression. The IMF says Australia's economy will be among the hardest hit in the world, shrinking by nearly 7% this year. That's bringing a spectacular end to our 29 years of growth. It says we'll see a sharp rebound with growth over 6% next year, but only if the pandemic peaks by July and social distancing restrictions are eased. That's a big if. And even if we see that strong bounce back in growth, 9% of the workforce will still be without a job. And it's young Australians likely to shoulder the worst of the crisis over the next decade. Youth unemployment peaked at 20% in the recession of 1992, and economists warn history is likely to repeat itself. Stephanie Chalmers has a story.
Danielle's career was only in its first act, and now it's paused indefinitely.
The last job that I had was on March the 13th, and every job after that got cancelled.
The 25-year-old has been working as a camera assistant for 2.5 years and says momentum is everything.
It's all based on networking and working job to job, impressing the person above you and hopefully getting them to put you forward for the next job.
Young Australians were doing it tough even before COVID-19. The youth unemployment rate was 12% and underemployment was 18%. In both cases, more than double the rate for any other age group.
Job advertisements have plummeted by 50% compared to this time last year, especially in retail, hospitality, arts, recreation, sport and childcare.
Around 40% of younger workers are in retail or hospitality, two of the hardest hit sectors throughout this crisis.
History suggests the years ahead will see lost job opportunities for young workers. During the early 1990s recession, the jobless rate for 15 to 24-year-olds peaked above 20%. After the global financial crisis hit, it climbed again, hitting 14% in 2014 and remaining elevated today. Greg Weiss works as an outplacement consultant. If you're meeting him, you've probably been made redundant or been retrenched. He's had a lot of meetings over the past few weeks and says the graduate job market has been hard hit.
I'm also seeing people who are in jobs in their early stages of their graduate careers, and some people who are at probably at their most vulnerable stages because it's a syndrome of last in, first out.
Students in their final years of study have had practical placements cancelled or moved online.
You can read as many books as you want and you can hear about different cases and things like that, but until you have the practical component, it's really hard to kind of have it all come together.
At 30, Hannah is already classed as a mature-aged student in her speech pathology course. She's confident about the long-term job prospects, but is worried about short-term delays.
It's already a 4-year course, which is quite long in compared to some others. I'm really eager to get out there in the workforce.
But what sort of workforce she'll graduate into is uncertain. More than a decade after the GFC, the effects are still being felt in the graduates' job market. In 2008, 85% of graduates found a full-time job within 4 months of finishing their degree. Last year, it was just 72%. And for those able to keep or find a job, the prospects for pay are not looking good. Greg Weiss has seen pay cuts ranging from 20% across the board at a high-end consulting firm to 40% for all employees at a software company.
Having a collective approach to saying, let's all reduce our remuneration is something I'm seeing across the board.
So pay cuts and pay freezes is likely to become the reality for thousands, if not millions, of Australian workers across the country.
That could see employers take advantage of cheap younger workers in the years to come, at the expense of the more experienced workforce. But for now, Danielle's concern is when her next job will come, not how much it will pay.
It does play on your mind a little bit and is quite scary, to be honest.
A generation of workers waiting and hoping for their careers to resume regular programming.
Stephanie Chalmers there. Well, the bad economic news is coming thick and fast. Yesterday, we covered the worst business confidence numbers on record. Today, the key Westpac Consumer Confidence Survey plummeted, suffering its biggest monthly decline in its 47-year history. Westpac describes the survey findings as very disturbing. Its author is Chief Economist Bill Evans. Bill Evans, what's so disturbing about this report?
Well, Elise, bear in mind that we've been running this survey for 47 years, and this is the biggest monthly fall at 17.7% that we've ever recorded.
It's not quite at the lows reached during the 90s recession. Do you expect it to get there?
Well, it's interesting to look at some of the components of the index. So, for instance, we ask one question about the economic outlook over the next 12 months, and that was down 31%, once again the biggest fall that we've seen for 47 years. So the near-term outlook is certainly very dire, but when we asked them for the outlook over 5 years, that only fell by 3.8%. The level it reached was not particularly significant. We've seen bigger falls than that. So I think what we're seeing is that we're seeing consumers that are very worried about the short term, but can see the way through that these sharp shocks will not be sustained for an extended period, and so are more comfortable with the medium-term outlook.
On whether people will spend or save the government's cash payments, only 27% expect to spend it all. That will not be what the government and many businesses are hoping they'll do. Does that surprise you, that level?
Look, I think people are very cautious, and 27% said they would spend it all, and around 50% said they'd spend at least half. It's interesting to compare that with those cash payments that we saw in 2008, where 62% ended up spending the lot. Now, I don't know whether their anticipation at the time was that they'd spend, that a lot less than 62% said they'd spend it. But if those anticipations are right, then certainly we've got a lot more caution this time than we saw back in 2008, and of course that's another factor that will impact upon the pace of the economic recovery.
Housing confidence has collapsed. We're a country that for the last couple of years has really been riding on the back of the housing market. Are you surprised at how much confidence in that has collapsed?
Look, Elise, of course we were expecting to see a big hit to overall confidence. We're expecting to see a big hit to the outlook for the economy and, of course, the spending outlook. But I was quite shocked by the 26.6% fall in that question, is now a good time to buy a dwelling, because once again that's the biggest monthly fall we've seen for 47 years. I was also shocked by the 50% fall in the outlook for prices, and we've never seen anything like that. Now, admittedly, we've only been doing that question since 2009, but the biggest fall we'd seen before that was only around 12 or 13%.
The business confidence outlook is bad, the consumer confidence outlook is bad. Do you think that the government will be looking at this and thinking that they may need to come through with maybe another support program or more stimulus?
I think that's on the agenda. I think the government won't be backward in coming forward if they believe that's needed. But as I said to you, I think the key now is to ensure that recovery that we've forecast in the December quarter happens. And so if we think about JobKeeper finishes at the end of September. It may be necessary to extend that further. If we think about some of the other stimulus that the government's given, it also has a sunset clause on it. And so I think that's where the issue is going to be, as to whether we can make sure that recovery that remains our central forecast can actually, and we can ensure that happens.
Bill Evans, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Elise.
The IMF expects China's economy to experience the least disruption from COVID-19. It predicts China to grow at 1.2% this year and a huge growth of 9.2% next year. Good news for our miners, but there are concerns it's gone too early. Li Ganglu, we're getting the reports that China is getting back to work. How much of the economy is back to work? Surely it's not back to 100%.
Yeah, we think that China probably has been back to work around 70 to 80%. If you look at large-scale firms, except Wuhan and the Hubei province, almost 100% of those large-scale firms are back to production. Keep in mind that those other firms are in the NBS, National Bureau of Statistics Industrial Production Report. So that's the reason I think perhaps for March IP, we will see on Friday, it could be slightly better than our expectation. Even for SMEs, the back to work ratio is already at around 80%.
What does this mean, do you think, for Australian exports? We saw double-digit declines in iron ore over a couple of months now. Will the production that we're seeing in these factories and in these workplaces be back to as much as it was before?
I do think that despite slightly weaker than expected recovery we may see in Q2, China will have to import more from the resource-rich countries. Our expectation for Q2 GDP growth is that China could regain its growth at around 2.5%. In the second half, we may see around 6.7%. So for the year as a whole, we are not as that pessimistic as some international organizations.
What about the risk of reinfection or a bounce in infection rates?
Indeed, we have been seeing imported confirmed cases. This has made this service sector return to work more cautious. And this then will have to discount some kind of service sector recovery in the remainder of the year.
So overall growth for China for this year at 2.5% doesn't sound so bad, really. Will the Chinese government be thinking about any kind of stimulus program within China?
We do think so. 2.5% is a very dismal growth number, although relative to the rest of the world, it's not too bad. But think about China's, required new job creation for this year. We have around 8 million college graduates entering into the job market. The government would have to find job for these folks.
Australia was a huge beneficiary of China's stimulus program on the back of the GFC. There are some doubts from our former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, whether China could possibly afford another stimulus program of that size again, and we shouldn't depend on it. What's your view?
I think in the short term, China does have a lot of fiscal and monetary policy room to boost growth. For example, on the monetary policy side, given the Fed has entered into zero interest rate, unlimited QE, this has liberated the PBOC to do more. They can cut interest rate more aggressively down the road. On the fiscal policy side, despite a lot of local government debt in China, central government fiscal condition remains very healthy.
Li Ganglu, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.